Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to the Royal Theatre at the Royal Łazienki Museum here in Warsaw. My name is Richard BUTTERWICK-PAWLIKOWSKI. I have the pleasure of introducing this debate, and it will be chaired by my dear friend and colleague, Professor Tobias SCHUMACHER, in the middle. I would first like to welcome you to a world which is very much a personal world. It is the world of the last few decades of old Poland, the otherwise known as the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. What you see around you is a monument to the vision of the last king of Poland, King Stanisław August Poniatowski, and a monument to the European ambitions of that Poland of the end of the 18th century, shortly before it was wiped off the map of Europe in the three partitions. I'd like to say a big thank you to a number of people. First of all, to the director and the management of the Royal Łazienki Museum for allowing us to use this magnificent venue. Second, to Madam Vice Rector for recognizing the priority of this event and for providing the necessary resources. And a very big thank you to all those members of staff who have worked very hard to make this a reality. We have the administrators of our two chairs, Anna Banach and Maja Olszewska. We have the man who makes events at Natolin a reality, Marek Rybak. We have our wonderful technician, Robert Ściekutek. We have our communications team, represented here by Chiara Bravi and Alexandra Severin. And we have our careers team, with Łukasz Dobromirski, not here, who has trained our speakers, or at least helped them to become even better in the art of public speaking. So, a big thank you to all of those. For those of you who have not yet experienced the Natolin magic, and I'm very pleased to say there are a number of you here, besides our own students, besides our former students, and besides our members of staff. Perhaps we have some future students of Natolin here. We have a gorgeous campus at the edge of Warsaw provided to us by the Polish government. It is one of the two campuses of the College of Europe, an institution founded in Bruges in 1949, which opened its second campus at Natolin in 1992. We offer a one-year advanced master's program in interdisciplinary European studies, one that is chosen by about 120 students from about 30 different countries. And that program has 4 specialisms. One of which, appropriately enough, you might think, for those thinking of going on to great things in Brussels, is about European public affairs and policies. Another, with their eye on the wider world, European Union as a global actor. And then there are the 2 specialities which reflect our 2 chairs. There is the European Neighbourhood and the European Neighbourhood Policy, for which there is the particular responsibility of the chair of the European Neighbourhood Policy, headed by Professor SCHUMACHER. And there is, most appropriately for this venue, the major in European history and civilization, for which there is a particular responsibility of my chair, the European Civilization Chair, which was founded by the European Parliament in memory of the great medieval historian and Polish and European statesman Bronisław Geremek. Now, look around you. We're in a theatre. Fortunately for us, it is an indoor theatre. But the point would be even stronger if we were outside on the theatre on the island with its Greek-inspired seating and the Roman-style ruins on the stage itself. We see the symbols, the architecture, the sculpture, and the painting that recall and evoke classical antiquity. you've had the opportunity to visit the Gallery of Sculptures. These are plaster casts gathered by King Stanisław August for the most part, so that his young Polish artists would have the chance to learn from the very best models as they were considered at the end of the 18th century in that neoclassical age of classical civilization. Statues such as the Laocoon group, the Apollo Belvedere, the Flora Farnese. And there are also in that part of the gallery busts of Polish heroes. These were taken in the early 20th century from the busts that adorn the Knights' Hall, or sometimes called the National Hall at the Royal Castle. That hall, which I strongly encourage you to visit in the Royal Castle if you've not done so before, is intended as a lesson in the different types of ways in which it is possible to serve your country. And the whole thing is explained by a quotation from Virgil. So that is there, we might say today, as a kind of lesson in the politics of history and memory. To go back to the statues here, where are they from? The plaster casts were made here, but the originals were those of that Greco-Roman civilization centered on the Mediterranean, which extended a great deal further east and further northwest than that. Among them is a bust of Antinous, a beautiful youth much beloved of the Emperor Hadrianus. And when he died, he was born in Bithynia in present-day Turkey, that's significant, and he died drowning in the Nile in Egypt. That's also significant. The emperor deified him after his death, built a city in his honor. We are outside the limits of what is conventionally, either geographically or politically, regarded as Europe. And where are we here? We're almost in the dead center of Europe geographically. Not quite, it's actually a bit further northeast, near Vilnius in Lithuania. But yet there is the feeling that we are here at the periphery. Well, this is a long way north of the old Roman limes, the frontier. The coins, the artifacts, they've been dug up, they got this far, but Roman rule did not. But 500 years after the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, this part of Europe opened itself up to Rome, to the Christianity that was centered on Rome. And that has continued for 1,050 years. And then just 20 years after that, a little bit to the east in Kiev, as you will remember, our students, when you saw the Church of Holy Wisdom or Saint Sophia in Kiev, Kievan Rus made an analogous choice, but to a different Rome, that new Rome, the Rome of the East, Constantinople. And that Rome still had another 500 years to run almost before it became Istanbul. And among the titles of the Ottoman sultans or caliphs was Roman emperor. Now, all that should give you something of a flavor of how this idea of a wider Europe has changed, and yet there have been continuities over the centuries. Continuities and changes that have been reflected in the identities and the values that we are to discuss tonight. And it's a great pleasure that it is our students from different places that will be discussing these things, at which point it's enough from me and it is time to hand over the microphone to my dear colleague, Professor Tobias Schumacher.
Thank you very much, Richard. Good afternoon and a very warm welcome from my side as well. As was said repeatedly now by Professor Butterwick, my name is Tobias Schumacher. Just for those of you who do not yet know me, I'm the chairholder of the European Neighbourhood Policy Chair at the Natolin campus of the College of Europe. And I have the pleasure to moderate and chair this debate this very evening. Now, before I introduce our 6 speakers, 3 to my left, 3 to my right, and eventually hand over to them, allow me to just make one comment and two remarks. Two remarks related in particular to the subject, to the very theme of tonight's debate. A wider Europe, question mark, identities and values between the EU and its neighbors. Now that is a theme that, strictly speaking, we debate literally on a daily basis at Natolin, given the multitude of identities, given the multitude of worldviews, therefore, of our student body, parts of which is represented here on the stage and, of course, in the audience. And it's also reflected, as I said, in the composition of our speakers, as you will see in a moment, given the very different positions that they will eventually put forward when it comes to this particular topic. Now, that's the general remark. As far as our subject is concerned, let me say that undoubtedly there are many good reasons why discussing this very theme tonight is useful, why it is important. One of which, I think at least, relates to the issue of cohesiveness. Cohesiveness of EU member states on one hand, but also cohesiveness of the neighboring countries, or what the European Union considers to be neighboring countries. And I'm singling out cohesiveness simply because cohesiveness is a phenomenon that is changing in EU member states as well as in neighboring countries, as a result, of course, of demographic change, as a result of exposure to the forces of globalization, as a result of the seemingly unstoppable flow of migrants and refugees due to unresolved conflicts, widening gaps between the haves and the have-nots, but also as a result of, at least in a large number of EU member states, democratic regression, or as far as neighborhood partner countries are concerned, autocratic consolidation, if you wish, autocratic stubbornness, as I would call it. So put differently, I guess, what is at the very core of the changing cohesiveness of EU member states and the neighborhood, what the European Union considers to be the neighborhood, and their relations with one another, past, present, and future, is in fact the question of what unites us and what separates us. How do we deal with this self versus the other dichotomy? And what is the civilizational, what is the social glue, so to speak? What is the ideational kit? What is the values reservoir, if you wish, that regulates and orders our interactions within borders and boundaries, but also beyond, across time and across space? Talking about space brings me to my second comment, before I will eventually hand over to our dear panelists. And I think it's an important point because knowing what we're going to listen to in a moment, this point will resurface in some of the presentations, and I'm quite convinced that a number of you will address this point in the Q&A as well. The very use of, so to speak, and references to terms such as neighbors, neighborhood, good neighborliness, as the Lisbon Treaty, for example, stipulates it in Article 8, or expressions such a ring of fire, as opposed to a ring of friend. All these, in my view, do not only reflect a perceived need among many in some parts of Europe to come up with a new narrative in a post-enlargement, a de facto post-enlargement environment. What is more, in my view at least, is that they also function together, of course, with corresponding policies by the European Union as supreme geopolitical constitutive acts, if you wish, instantiating a very particular, a very peculiar geopolitical imaginary of the nature of Europe and its boundaries. So in other words, they reflect a very particular geopolitical vision of what can be coined hub and spoke Europe, where the European Union locates itself very much at the center as a pole of attraction, as an alleged source of order and ordering even, while the space beyond those borders and boundaries is considered to be the extreme opposite. Now, it goes without saying that this view is problematic. It's paternalistic, if you wish. It bestows upon the other, that is to say the neighbor, inferiority. It treats the other as different, as being different. It treats the other as someone that is not belonging to whatever Europe eventually is, if we are to consider Europe to be synonymous with the European Union. Some would even say it regards the other as unemancipated. Now, our panel discussion this very afternoon, this early evening, takes issue precisely with this problematic geospatial vision, this arguably restrictive notion of Europeanness, and of course the previous points, but it will also go beyond them. So much from my side for now. I will now introduce our 6 speakers. Let me start on my very left. We have Eléonore GARNIER, who holds an MA in European Studies from the University of Geneva, as well as a BA in European Studies from the University of Regensburg in Germany. When living in Bern, in Switzerland, she was heavily involved in contributing to fostering good, sustainable Switzerland-EU relations. And she's currently writing an MA thesis of the role of socialization in EU twinning projects in Moldova. It's good to have you, Eléonore. Our second speaker eventually will be Eya YOUNSI from Tunisia. Eya studied law at the University of Legal, Political and Social Sciences of Tunis, where she also received a bachelor degree in Tunisian private law, and she pursued a master's degree in common law, also in Tunis. Her research interests revolve very much around international relations, around conflict management, around negotiation, as well as international commercial arbitration. A very warm welcome to you too, Eya. Then eventually the third speaker tonight will be Mikkel KELSTRUP. Mikkel holds a master's degree in history from the University of Copenhagen. He studied also at universities in Germany and China. He gained some work experience in the Danish permanent representation to the European Union, where he worked very intensively on the EU-Russia file, on the sanctions regime, on the conflict in Ukraine. And he has a very strong interest, not just in issues related to European security, but also revolving around the history of ideas. A very warm welcome to you as well, Mikkel. Our fourth speaker tonight is going to be Laura WHETHERLY, who studied history at St. Peter's College at Oxford. She is particularly interested in Russian and Spanish history, as well as the history of journalism. And she hopes, in fact, and I found it very intriguing, so I would want to single it out, she hopes for a future career in the armed services. And in her free time, she is engaged in a lot of sports activities. A very warm welcome to you too, Laura. Our fifth speaker is right next to me here. It's Anna SIWIERSKA, here from Poland. She studied law and economics at the University of Warsaw. She worked in the European Parliament as a parliamentary assistant, and besides being very passionate about tonight's topic, one of the reasons why she is on this very panel tonight, she is a passionate lover of music, and in particular, she's passionate about the piano, I understand. So, a very warm welcome to you too. Our very last speaker tonight is going to be Albert, or I should say Dr. Albert HAYRAPETYAN. Albert has a PhD in economics from Armenian State University of Economics. He has an MA in International Relations from the American University of Armenia, a very good one actually, where he also worked as a teaching assistant at some point in time, a position that was then eventually followed up by 2 stints as a researcher in 2 governmental think tanks in Yerevan. A very warm welcome to you too, Albert. So let me just, in a sentence or 2, explain how we have arranged this panel debate, how we are going to set it up. Each of our speakers will have a maximum of 4 minutes to make his or her point, to raise his or her argument. And once all 6 speakers have presented their respective arguments, we will immediately open the floor, collect, probably in the first round, 3 questions or comments, and you would have to make also clear, say this very explicitly, who your question is addressed to. So our very first speaker tonight will be Eléonore GARNIER. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Schumacher. And thank you to every one of you who has joined us this afternoon in these beautiful premises of the WHETHERLY Museum to discuss identity and values of the EU and its neighbors. I have to say the first thing that struck me when reading the topic of the debate tonight was, how did we even come up with a word such as wider Europe? Isn't Europe enough after all? When have we started to say Europe when we actually meant the European Union? Well, this shift in the use of words is what the ancient Greeks called the metonymy. Since forever we have been accustomed to make logical association between words and ending up naming things with other things that are directly or indirectly linked to them. So this common metonymy of saying Europe when we actually meant the European Union is actually showing us one thing. Yes, the EU has become a natural and evident reference of belonging and form of governance to the Europeans, or at least in their representation of themselves in the wider world. So where is the problem here? Well, in fact, this metonymy has also a much less enjoyable side effect: the exclusion of the non-EU member states. Let's look at this yet another common expression, non-EU member states. How did we never come up with a word to designate our fellow Europeans that was just not the negation of us? Surely most identities are built through a certain differentiation or even abnegation of the other, and the Europeans don't seem to be an exception to this rule. Eventually, we came up with the word of neighbor with the launch of the European Neighbourhood Policy in 2003. But even if the word of neighbor is an affirmative one, it still carries an excluding meaning. The neighbors, may they be European or not, are to be excluded from the European common home. So here we are. European identity, as understood by membership to the EU, has become a largely shared vision, but a vision that excludes. Some countries might appreciate to be excluded, like Switzerland or Norway, but others feel highly discriminated, like the countries of the Western Balkans or the countries of the Eastern Partnership. Even though discrimination is not a word that we would like to use to name our actions, it is still this same discrimination that carries the EU normative and transformative power, the power to infuse the neighborhood with our values: human rights, peace, achieved through rule of law, democracy, and spirit of compromise. These are the values that have shaped our identity as Europeans. But the problem is, these values are set in an antagonistic representation with other words like corruption and authoritarian law, which are the words that we use to describe our neighbors. But those words are not values. They are diseases that we also in the EU have to be cautious about. So our challenge now is to actually overcome those false antagonisms, because they are polarizing our relations with the neighbors, and we all strive to enjoy fundamental rights and freedoms. It is time to think and build the European common home, and here by European, I don't mean to reproduce any metonymy here. Thank you for your attention.
So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As Professor Schumacher just stated, my name is Eya YOUNSI, and I am a citizen of an EU neighboring country, namely Tunisia. What I would like to discuss with you today within the frame of our subject is the efficiency, or rather the inefficiency, of the absorption of the EU norms and values by Muslim communities, depending on their perceptions of the EU, whether within or beyond its borders. As we all know, the EU today is facing several challenges, whether they take the form of continuing incoming flows of immigrants, a refugees crisis, a growing Muslim communities, or waves of terrorist attacks. They all greatly contribute to the overprotection of the EU norms and values and to the strengthening of this fortress Europe. Nonetheless, these challenges are even greater on the existing and the incoming communities themselves. Indeed, they are overwhelmed by the stream of values that they have to adhere to, and sometimes at the expense of their own norms and values in order to be able to stay. It is as if the rule is no longer abide by the law, but rather abide by the norms, as if Rousseau's social contract becomes an adhesion contract, a take-it-or-leave-it deal. This clash of the norms might ingrain in them a feeling that they come from different worlds and not just different continents. This feeling is unfortunately also echoed on an international level. For example, in the frame of the relationship of the EU with some countries from the MENA region, a typical example of an adhesion contract. The EU often uses and even abuses of its strong bargaining position in order to ensure the strict application of its norms and value by employing financial aid as a leverage. The shortcomings of this approach are best displayed by the crisis in the Eurozone, for example. Indeed, with the budgetary cuts that ensued from it, many norms-receiving countries were just no longer motivated to apply them. This is, I believe, a direct effect of an overestimation of the EU, of its legitimacy, and more specifically of its normative legitimacy, whether its actions are desirable, proper, or appropriate within some socially constructed system of norms, values, and beliefs. What I am trying to say here today is that the intentions are good, but the means are not always good, that the EU should exchange more conditionality for more cooperation, and by embracing the specificities of each community and each country, it could remedy these costly inefficiencies, whether in terms of time or means. One might wonder then, why is the EU still pushing for an inefficient path that is out of date? Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have 2 points to make to you tonight. My first point is that Russia is essentially a European country. My second point is that when EU officials speak about European values, it's the case of the EU seeking to claim ownership of the European civilizational heritage. Now, please let me elaborate. Out of the 51 independent states in Europe, only 28 of them are members of the EU, at least for now. Russia, well, out of these non-EU countries, this includes Norway, Iceland, Belarus, Georgia, Armenia, Ukraine, each with their own distinct histories and languages and cultures and traditions and so on. Russia is more problematic to characterize as European, as it stretches from the borders of Norway to the borders of North Korea. Academics have discussed whether it should be classified as an Asian power, a Eurasian power, or as a European power. I believe that it's a European power. The evidence of, as evidence for this, you can use ruins, paintings, weapons, clothing, etc. And in this case, I will use culture to demonstrate my points. And I believe that there are many examples of European Russian cultural heritage, but tonight I'll only use one person in the form of Lev Tolstoy. He's considered one of Russia's greatest writers, recognized in the world for his realist fiction. He's from an aristocratic background. He spoke French from early on. And he traveled widely in Europe for several years, where he, in Paris, met Victor Hugo, whom he later admitted was a great influence on his writings. His literary characters, they also follow the latest fashions of Paris, they follow the scientific and business advancements in Germany, and you will generally get a feeling that they're very much oriented towards the western part of Europe. Tolstoy's family itself left Russia in the aftermath of the 1905 revolution, and his descendants today live in the UK, in France, Germany, and Sweden. And we have his great-great-granddaughter, Victoria Tolstoy, who is today a famous jazz singer in Sweden. And in fact, she participated in a season of the television show Big Brother in the year 2000. And if that's not a sign of Europeanness, then I don't know what is. So that's one example of a key figure in Russian culture intertwined with the rest of Europe. But as I mentioned, there are many examples of this, but because of time constraints, I'll only stick to this. Generally, I believe that the shared heritage it's broadly based on Christianity, the medieval knighthood traditions, such as eating with knife and fork, shared imaginations of classical Greece and Rome, as we see tonight, and then elements of high culture, such as arts, literature, paintings, etc. Now, with regards to how EU values today find expression, I'll refer to the TV debates between Merkel and Schulz in September, where they disagreed on many topics, but there's one thing that they agreed on, and that was the fact that Turkey's EU accession talks should be halted, because Turkey violated a number of so-called EU values, such as human rights, freedom of press, etc. They are more specifically named in the Lisbon Treaty. Now, in my mind, and here's my main points, when Brussels talks of European values, it's a case of the EU seeking to claim ownership of the civilizational heritage of the entire European continent. I believe that Europe should not become a monopoly possession of bureaucrats in Brussels. The unity of European culture is simply the end product of 3,000 years of labor by our diverse ancestors. And it's our task to preserve and renew it. That's all I had to say for now. Thank you for your attention.
Good evening. So the title of this evening's debate talked about identities and values between the EU and its neighbours. So what I wanted to do was kind of unpick what the word values actually means. So a value is a principle, and it guides how we act. And therefore, it's a really big part of our identity, both personally and politically. And as a result, values often show up a lot in political discourse. And the example that sprung to my mind was with Brexit. So a lot of the Brexit debate, at least in the UK, came back to this idea that UK and EU values in some way are incompatible, that there's something kind of exceptional in the British value system, which could explain why Britain never really bought into the idea of the EU as much as a lot of other European nations did. And that idea has really persisted well beyond the actual referendum. And actually just a few weeks ago, Juncker brought this idea up in his State of the Union address. And the quote I've got here, he said, on the 30th of March 2019, and that's the day that the UK is officially going to exit the EU, we will wake up to a union where we all stand by our values. And the EU values he defined are freedom, equality, and the rule of law. And I thought this was quite an interesting idea, and I wanted to go and look up maybe where the values differ. So it's a little bit harder to find a summary of British values, but there is one from a 2015 law, and it states that British values are democracy, liberty, the rule of law, and mutual respect. So very, very similar. Basically, they're identical. And so we've got politicians who, on one hand, are justifying Brexit on the basis of this values dissonance, but they're also laying claim to exactly the same values that the EU holds. And this is a really interesting idea, I think. And to explore it a little bit more, I want to speak about a person who I think is quite representative of a lot of Brexit voters, and that's my grandfather. So he believed passionately, without question, in the rule of law, in democracy, and in freedom. And he was also an active participant in the EU. So he believed in cultural sharing and free movement. He went on holiday to Germany, to Spain. He had Italian colleagues. He had very, very close to his Polish neighbours. But at the same time, he never considered himself a European. In fact, he was totally skeptical of anything that could be considered continental. It was always us and the continent, them, over there. And really, this is my key point, because my granddad wasn't unusual. He certainly wasn't unique. You can hold values in a multiplicity of contexts. A lot of British people really consider freedom, democracy, the rule of law to be totally essential to their political identity. But the discourse that surrounds these values is not Europeanized. So obviously, this example is all totally Anglo-centric. And I'm not pretending, I'm not trying to speak directly about the experiences of any European neighbouring state. However, I do think that Brexit is important because it demonstrates an example where EU soft power never Europeanized a national culture. And if our ultimate goal as a European Union is ever closer union, then this is a really important lesson to learn from. I really think that we don't talk enough about cultural identity when we're discussing the relationship between the EU and its neighbours. Values are really central, like I said before, both to our political identity and our personal identity. But the way that we really understand these values is really conditioned by the discourse that surrounds them. And that's a discourse which comes up through culture, our history, our shared experience, and our way of looking at the world. And it's discourse surrounding values which creates political identities, and ultimately, therefore, is what will create European citizens. Thank you.
So speaking about wider Europe and our ideas in identities and values between the EU and its neighbors, I would like to remind you of a quote from Schuman Declaration, that Europe will not be made all at once or according to a single plan. It will be built through a concrete achievements which first create a de facto solidarity. So the question of identities and values between the EU and its neighbors is faced by a difficult choice. Should the EU's actions be based on values or rather be a realization of particular interests? And this question determines the credibility of the EU as an international actor. On the one point, the EU's actions are often understood as a kind of philanthropy, the good force. According to this view, the EU supports its neighbors based on inalienable values and ideas that the EU wants to promote. Of course, on the other hand, we've got also opponents who can see Union's actions based only on particular interest. But we should agree that the EU is about exporting values outside, not just about economic interest. Similarly, the ENP is about creating a good neighborhood of friendly states around the EU, remaining in a good relationship with others. However, in practice, the assumptions which determine the EU's actions, as well as understanding of values, are different in neighboring states. And this is a very important point that, for example, in the EU, we believe that democracy is the best of previously imagined system, or that the rule of law is the only way to provide the community with security and stability. And this is not so obvious in every country in the EU. The reality is that democracy is not the universally favored form of government. And paradoxically, the difference in politics may sometimes occur not due to ill will of the states, but due to different perception of basic democratic standards. So nowadays, the EU is transforming its surroundings and it's trying to build a wider Europe. The question is, how deep and how far this transformational force can be? Wider Europe also means wider thinking and accepting differences. In view of this, can the transfer of democratic standards to Ukraine, Belarus, Moldavia have an impact on democratization to the biggest neighbor in the region, Russia? So to build a stable, democratic and economically strong environment, we need to develop methods of changing values in neighboring countries, for example in Russia or in China. The question is, how far can we go and how many differences can we accept? Respect for differences and diversity is important, but we cannot give up the principles which we consider to be fundamental.
Okay. Distinguished Professor Schumacher, distinguished Professor BUTTERWICK-PAWLIKOWSKI, dear classmates, ladies and gentlemen. Today, I'm going to speak about the need and the importance to constantly reinvent Europe. It's interesting to note that Europe was the daughter of Phoenician king Agenor, whose name means brave, manly. Europe means wide eye. Compare the ope of Europe with the words such as optician or optical. Phoenicia was located outside of Europe, on the territory of modern-day Syria. This is very representative of fluxes and exchanges of peoples and cultures, which happens constantly. This also tells us that a national or transnational identity can be woven around outsiders as well, based on much wider perspective on one's cultural, political, and social views. Constructual law tells us, for any living mechanism to persist in time, i.e., to survive and to live, the free movement of energy needs to be ensured inside and, most importantly, outside that system. One needs to ask themselves where the boundaries between inside and outside interact, if they exist at all. The world of energy matter is based on constant motion and change. Big Bang started a circle of motion, a process of evolution and further involution probably. Yoga, Buddhism, modern quantum physics, all point to the phenomenon of an eternally changing reality. As Heraclitus put it in 5th century BCE, one cannot enter the same river twice. Dovetailing the mentioned ideas of free movement of energy and the identities intertwined around outsiders, we reach a cunning inference. As all things are in motion in the world of energy matter, so identities are. Identities and personalities wear out, just like our old clothes or computers do. And these need constant upgrades and change. One either expands as a living organism by constantly creating new cells, or goes on to slowly decompose and be recycled in the cycle of life. If European Union wants to persist longer, it needs to reinvent itself constantly. As Margaret Thatcher truly noticed, mentioning during her speech in College of Europe, in our university, in my university, Europe would never have prospered and never will prosper as a narrow-minded, inward-looking club. The root of suffering is ignorance, avidya, as they call it in Sanskrit, which literally means not seeing. From not seeing, clearly a sense of separate selves arise, which is a root of violence, because for as long as there is me, there will be you, us and them. Is there a true boundary that separates Europe from non-Europe? The yoga of Europe must continue. Yoga literally means union, and be like the sun, which shines indiscriminately on everyone and everything. The bravery of union, and Europe's father Agenor, and the clear vision of Europe adopted by European Union will bring more well-being into this one planet of ours. Dear ladies and gentlemen, Europe should not be a noun. Europe should be a verb. Dziękuję bardzo.
On this very note, let me thank our 6 panelists for these very intriguing and thought-provoking presentations, each one of which touching upon a rather different element of our theme that we are discussing now with all of you, I hope, tonight, namely wider Europe ? Identities and values between the EU and its neighbors. I would also like to thank you for observing the time. The way we will now arrange for this debate to take place is that I will have a very first round, we will have a very first round where I will collect a maximum number of 3 questions or comments, and I would like to ask each one of you who wants to raise a question to make it, as I said at the very beginning, explicit as to who you address the question to. And if you could also introduce yourself, that would be much appreciated. Who wants to be first? The gentleman in the very front, and then 1, 2, right.
Thank you, Santiago de Presilla with Visegrad Insight. I really like the idea of...
I'm sorry to interrupt you, we couldn't hear you.
Oh, sorry, Santiago de Presilla with Visegrad Insight. Can you hear me now? All right. I really like the idea of Europe as a verb. I think it's a very, contagious concept. But I'd also like to know, you were speaking about how Europe shouldn't lecture other countries. I think that was alluded to in the beginning as well. The only way that Europe can spread its values, some people would say, would be by projecting stability from within. And I think it's very hard to talk about democratizing Russia, for example, when we have problems with the court system in the country we're sitting in, with problems with the freedom of press in a member state. It was last week that a journalist was assassinated. Is this the solution? How can Europe provide this idea of stability from within without being too self-centered?
Thank you very much. And the second one is over here in the front as well.
My name is Octavian Milewski. I'm an alumnus of the college, not only in campus, Falcone and Borsellino promotion. My question is to the third speaker. Correct me if I'm mispronouncing your name, Mr. KELSTRUP. You referred to Russia as European, or Russia's Europeanness, if I'm not mistaken, right? And of course, you operated this term, or operationalized it through the figure of a luminary, Lev Tolstoy, and his role in the universal literature and so on. As you all know, his magnum opus is Война и мир, War and Peace. So I would refer to that, and through that I would ask you, is war a European value nowadays? And as a concrete example of war in present-day Europe, I would mention Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine, and Russia's sponsorship of that war. Is Russia's Europeanness acceptable through this action in Ukraine's east? And I would add there Russia's annexation of Crimea. And a second question related to this, quickly. Is structural Europeanness defined through Copenhagen criteria? And does Russia apply, or does Russia fit to these criteria? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Octavian, and the gentleman on your right.
Thank you for the discussion. So actually, I am Ostap Kushnir from Lozarsk University, PhD. So while listening to the panelists, I made up a couple of questions, but I won't raise all of them. So my question is to the panelist from the UK. So Oxford professor Zielonka arrived at the point that Europe actually is an empire consisting of different concentric circles of states and regions and whatever elements orbiting around the core. So, and from this perspective, we have Eurozone states, non-European states, northern part of Europe, which is different from the southern part of Europe, eastern versus western, and the core here is the German-French axis. From this perspective, Britain still remains a part of European empire. Do you agree to this point of view or not? And the second question, actually, it is also, referring to Mr. Zielonka's, Professor Zielonka's claims, and I think that the lady from Tunisia would probably, my question goes to you. So he said at the conference World in Focus in Warsaw last week that in order for the European Union to gain more efficiency, its member states should commit suicide, quote. The power should be redistributed between the European Union institutions and the regional administrations located in the biggest cities. What's your opinion on that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would suggest we end there for now before we go into a second round, and we start in reverse order, if that is okay with you. Maybe you can start, actually, Laura, and then we go over to you, Eya, and eventually Mikkel and Albert.
Okay. So thank you for your question. I think it's really interesting. However, I do take quite a lot of... I think there's a big problem. Although it's a really nice little soundbite, a European empire, I really don't think that that holds up to a lot of scrutiny, particularly because from a historical perspective, an empire means something really quite specific. Although you do have this sort of center and the concentric circles, and yes, in Europe, there are sort of different axes of power. There is a sort of sense of a hierarchy. And this idea of a really centralized state with subordinate powers around it, I don't think reflects Europe today, or in fact the idea of Europe at all. So although I do agree that even with Brexit, Britain will inevitably be part of sort of a European atmosphere, I don't think it can ever escape being part of the idea of Europe and the geopolitical reality of Europe. But I would disagree on the idea that it's still part of a European empire, because I would very strongly argue against the idea that the EU is a European empire at all. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
So thank you for your question, Mr. Kushnev, I believe. I do not think that member states should commit suicide, nor that power should be allocated within them. I think that the way the EU is today is this forum and the community between the member state is good. It's just in certain points, and especially in their relationship with their neighbors, there are some kind of inconsistencies even with the union. So these inconsistencies would become even greater without this union, and would damage even further some of the relationships with within the neighborhood and with the neighborhood. So I do not agree that power should be divided, nor that the union should be dismantled. And I hope that I answered your question.
And thank you for your question. Regarding war and peace, is war a European values nowadays? I will say that historically there's been a lot of war in Europe, and speaking as a historian, I will say that war characterizes a big part of our history and knighthood culture. And also within the last 20 years, a number of European countries has participated in several wars. Regarding the the Russian annexation of Crimea, I will say this is a clear breach of international law. It's breaching the Budapest Memorandum, and I do not believe it's justified. So in this sense, I think Russia can be seen as a pendulum that swings back and forth from Europe. You have Catherine the Great, you have Peter the Great, who are reformers, who bring in civil servants from Germany, amongst others, to reform the state. During the Cold War, we have periods where Russia is approaching and leaving Europe. So I think the image of Russia as a pendulum, but essentially more to the European side than to the Eastern side, is how I would characterize it. In regards to the Copenhagen criteria, the structural Europeanness, yes, I believe this is structural EU-ness. I believe we have to distinguish between EU values and European values. By talking about European values, it's a bit too broad, it's a bit too ambitious, but I do believe it makes sense to talk about the EU values with reference to the Lisbon Treaty and the Charter of Fundamental Rights. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Gentleman from Poland asking about the question how can Europe provide idea of stability? So your question has more succinct answer and a long answer. So starting from succinct answer, I would say by constantly reinventing itself. And to go to the longer answer, so Europe is now a puzzle, but where now certain parts of this puzzle are missing, and thus making the whole picture incomplete. So back in 1988, when Margaret Thatcher was delivering a speech in College of Europe, in our university, and in your university also, if you are an alumni, so only very optimists could consider that Poland, your country, one day would become a member of the European Union. And I wonder if there were that many optimists, they would think that Croatia, that would be embroiled in war a couple of years after, to access the European Union, first of all to become independent state, and then to access the European Union. From the legal point of view, I think many things are already achieved. The Treaty on European Union and the part on common security and defense policy stipulates that if there is an attack, an act of aggression of one of the Union member state, the others should protect that member state by all means. But in saying by all means, I also understand, and first of all understand, the military means. But the thing is how it should be, how do I see the continuation of this? I think that by putting the missing parts of the puzzle together, in 1988, Margaret Thatcher told the following, I'm saying verbatim, we must never forget that east of the Iron Curtain, peoples who once enjoyed a full share of European culture, freedom and identity have been cut off these roots. We shall look on Warsaw, Prague and Budapest as great European cities. Now I'm saying we must look on Minsk and Yerevan, not less European and not less magnificent cities than those of Western Europe. Minsk is a capital of a country that lies in a geographic center of Europe. As for Yerevan, I have to note again Margaret Thatcher's famous speech where she mentioned the following. For 300 years we were a part of Roman Empire, and the map still traced the straight lines of roads the Roman built. Well, Romans didn't build any road in Armenia, since we were neighbors and not a part of the empire. And at that time, when British statehood hasn't yet been formed, one anecdotal incident, after being defeated by Armenian army, Roman beheaded head of Roman famous general Marcus Crassus was shown to public. Another Roman general, Lucullus, imported apricots from Armenia, which was then known as Armenian plum or Prunus armenica. When in 1918, Armenians were fighting with Turkish outnumbering soldiers, army, they were not only protecting our country, but the front line and not the border line of Europe. So I think to end my speech that in less than 20 years, we would see also Armenia and Belarus members of the European Union and making the puzzle more complete. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very first round. I would actually also want to add that I would in fact like to encourage our panelists to engage with one another. If you happen to have a comment or a remark in response to what you have heard. Let us open the second round for now. We will collect another 3 questions or comments. Who wants to be next? Yes, Alexandra.
Right, I have a question for the speaker from the...
Could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, of course. My name is Alexandra Trzeciak. I'm a graduate from the College of Europe. I have a question for the speaker from the UK. I thought your speech was really interesting in a way that it kind of drew a line between values and identity and showed how, while values might actually be very similar, identity can be a very different issue that can then lead to kind of concrete political outcomes. Which is quite a depressing conclusion. And my question for you would be kind of twofold and half-formed. I guess one would be, would you say that identity really was the kind of primary cause of the Brexit referendum? Because I think it's a very good approach to try to analyze this huge question by using one concrete example. And what kind of identity? Was it kind of this pre-existing different sense of self that you observe in your grandfather's case, or was it the way that it was politicized by the political class around the idea of, you know, the crisis of national sovereignty? And if so, then what would be your general conclusion for kind of the way that the EU should address the wider neighborhood? Just from your personal point of view, should we kind of discard values altogether just because their understanding is so out of control and dependent on the cultural context, or is there a different way to kind of engage to make sure that not only is identity similar, but also understood similarly in reference to other member states and other countries? Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. Who wants to be next? We have one over here. Roman, it's you yourself?
Yes.
Please, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm Roman from Keynes Promotion graduate. I also work here. I have a very quick question. Neo-functionalist inside me couldn't stand, and I want to ask, I think it will be more addressed to Anna and I think more to Anna, because what do you think about the new approach of European integration of the countries like Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova? So while they have association agreement, while they have visa-free regime, and now we're talking about single digital market, we're talking about energy union, that was what Poroshenko, for instance, said. Now they're talking about custom unions participation, Schengen participation. So you can see the kind of a hybrid integration right there. So is it, in your opinion, more of kind of a trade-off between all but institutions? Or some would say you implement something which you don't have influence over, you don't represent it in this institutions, or somebody would say that this is actually running after the train which left, or it's actually a very smart idea which in the end will require only political will to make a step forward. Because now what, for instance, Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova implements, Turkey never implemented in 60 years because it wasn't part of their integration. So I want to ask this question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we have space and time for a third one. Yes, over there, very top.
Thank you very much. My name is Yannick Blaschke from the current promotion, Simon Wey. And we heard a lot of criticism about the EU's use of concepts and the EU's policies towards neighbors, the very concept of neighbors itself. And I think that is important. It is important to take a step back at times and look how we use those terms and what we make of it. But to my mind, the value of this intellectual exercise is greatly diminished if we don't translate that into actually offering alternatives to how we address the day-to-day political business. So if I would translate that into 3 specific questions, I would like to ask Eléonore, how should we address our neighbors? Like, how should we call them, or how should the EU call them, since this has turned into a debate on the EU, more or less? To Eya, I would like to ask the question, how should the EU deal with an authoritarian regime that we certainly cannot see as an express of the democratic will of the people of its country? And to Mikkel, I would like to ask the question, how should the EU talk about its values? What is the great difference between the EU values and European values, and what should change in that regard? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yannick, for this very thought-provoking, threefold question, in fact. Let's start with this one, I would suggest, and let's go to Eléonore first, as one of these three was addressed to you.
Thank you, Yannick, for your question. Well, how should we call them? We just shall call them Europeans. And if you want to talk about any alternatives, well, actually my purpose right now at the College of Europe is to see if actually socialization, people-to-people contact has actually a much more effect than strict conditionality and very formal, ticking the boxes. Because this is, for instance, in the ENP, a kind of burden in certain projects that I'm dealing with. So that is, for example, something that I cannot provide you with an answer, but I think that this is really like the added value about Europe, is that we meet, there's mobility, we transfer values with empathy as well as working together. I think this is much more effective, and that the neighborhood policy should be much more have like those kind of alternatives, because conditionality and this ticking the box are actually problematic. And I will actually answer to one of the first questions that we're talking about stability. You've heard in my speech that I was much more focused on the words that we use, and I'm really concerned about this word stability, because right now the EU is kind of like having a certain fatigue, and now is trying to keep neighbors stable. And when you try to just keep them stable, then you actually build what now some analysts call stabilitocracy. And this is very problematic, because if we are using conditionality to create only facades of values, facades of democracy, facades of rule of law, this is what is problematic. So that would be my answers and comments. Thank you.
Yeah.
So thank you, Yannick, for your question. I just wanted to say something before I answer your question, is that throughout my essay I tried to convey that these tools that the EU is using, they are mainly in its relationship with democratic regimes and not authoritarian ones. For example, the Tunisian example, after the revolution and the establishment of a democracy, we can see that conditionality still exists, and the EU is still promoting its values and norms through conditionality and putting them on the table during trade deals, where I believe they have nothing to do there. And also my speech tried to show that this conditionality is also applied within the EU. Although I don't have a very clear alternative to this situation, but I will try, is that, as I said at the end of my speech, is that it should trade and exchange conditionality with more cooperation with these countries, and trying to listen and adapting at the same time that they are adapting to the EU itself. And at the end, I would like to end with a quote, if you may, is by... oh yeah, I'm sorry.
It's the microphone.
I'm just... by Rosabeth Moskanter, I apologize, who said that change is disturbing when it's done to us, but exhilarating when it's done by us. Thank you. And I hope that I answered your question.
Thank you, Eya. The third one by Yannick goes to you, Mikkel.
Thank you for your question, Yannick. I believe we should talk about, the EU should talk about its values as what they are, EU values. The concept of European values is a bit too vague because, as I mentioned, Moscow can be argued as European, Istanbul, Ankara can be argued as European. So if you refer to European values, this can be anything from west to east, north to south. But by EU values, it's very specifically set, and the EU should not be ashamed about addressing them for what they are. So it's a number of values you have to live up to in order to enter the club. So yeah. EU values is how they should be addressed as. Thanks.
And we have another question, the one that was raised by Roman, that goes to you, Anna.
Okay, thank you, Roman, for this question. This is a question about what can we do with this queue to the European Union and with all those agreements which are waiting, all those agreements with the EU is trying to postpone the answer for them. So I think that, of course, it's not good for the European Union, but we can appeal now the example of Poland. So while entering the EU, Poland didn't reach all the criteria. So this is also a kind of maybe giving a support for those countries to take them off the influence of our biggest neighbor, as Russia, for example. And of course, it's also a question of values and economic interests. So, in my opinion, we should help those countries, like it was done with example of Poland. So, for example, helping Moldavia, the democratization process there, it can be also good for us. Because it's much more safe to trade with the country which has stable democratic situation.
Thank you very much, Anna. And Laura, you're the last one for now, in response to Alexandra's question.
Thank you. So, in response, you had quite a few questions, I think, Alexandra, which are really, really interesting and far too broad for me to be able to give any sort of full answer in this time. But I think the sort of first part you were asking about, so would you say that identity was a primary cause of Brexit, and what sort of kinds of identity? To that, in short, I'd say yes, identity was a huge part of the ultimate Brexit result, and a lot of it came down to this myth of exceptionalism. So, in the UK, the EU referendum was used as a political tool a lot of the time, which sort of arising by saying the EU became a bit of a scapegoat. So it was we're doing this because the EU says we have to. And that definitely fed into a myth of it being the EU wants one thing and the UK wants something else. We're special, we're different. However, I don't want to particularly give one cause for Brexit because there are so many different things which would have fed into different ways of voting, different voting patterns, and I'm sure all of my other colleagues from the UK, if we all sat up here, we could identify, for example, a lot of regional differences. But I think at the end of the day, you're right, a lot of them can be brought back to this issue of identity and maybe feeling a need to defend something in the British sort of national character, which kind of made us different and separate, and that came about because maybe people didn't feel that British interests were being represented. And then the sort of second part you were asking about is, should we discard values altogether? And I think maybe my speech came across as a little too critical of the idea of values. I do think that they're important. And I actually think that they do have a meaning, particularly in our approach towards the European neighbourhood. Things like democracy, the rule of law. When the EU is talking about wanting, as Anya was talking about, a stable neighbourhood, then yes, these values are really important. But I also think that, as I said in my speech, although we shouldn't discard them, we should also really make an effort to understand, particularly within the EU, the different ways that values are understood, because they're not always understood as European values, as in the British case. So I hope that answered your questions a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have space for at least one more round. Are there any more questions or comments? If there is one, yes. Carsten.
Hi, Carsten Gerhardt from the current Simon Weil promotion. I have a question going to Eya and Albert. From your perception, coming from ENP countries, the inner struggles the European Union is facing with some member states and the question arising about rule of law, division of powers within member states of the European Union. To what extent would you consider, or the public discussion in your countries would consider that as an undermining of the bargaining value imposition power of the European Union towards your countries?
Thank you very much. Another one maybe? Yes, gentleman on the left.
I'm Mikkel KELSTRUP from the University of Warsaw. I have a question for Eléonore. Like, you've been all talking about what are EU values, what are European values. So the question is, can Europe as a continent be united in the face of the clash of values we even see within the European Union, because Poland says they have different values than Germany, for example. Can we work on that? Common European values that fit all the countries within Europe and build something on it.
Thank you very much. And the third one maybe? Yes.
Hi, I'm Amelia from the current promotion. My question is, don't you think that I guess my question goes to Eya, there's some sort of double standard between Eastern Partnership countries and Southern Neighborhood when it comes to European values like rule of law or freedom. Since I think we care more about these values that we call European in the Eastern Partnership, I think mainly because we oppose them to the Russian values. But in the Southern Neighborhood, we care more about stability because we don't want war and so on. So we can work very well with the King of Morocco or Al-Sisi. So yes, that's my remark.
Thank you very much. Let's start with the very last one. It was addressed to you, Eya.
Well, talking about double standards, yes, I believe that there are double standards in the relationship between the EU and its eastern partners and its southern partners. And I believe that it has more to do than making eastern partners and eastern neighbors, more Europeans in order to deal with the Russian imposition or promotion of values in the region. It has more to do with them being actually on the European continent and being more European than the southern neighborhood, who will never get access to these countries. And to pick on what Albert conveyed in his last answer, in his first answer to one of the questions, I think maybe it is some kind of preparation of integrating these countries within the EU, hopefully sometime in the near future. And also there is the principle of differentiation that has been installed recently, which is some kind of answer to the standardization of the ENP. And yes, there are double standards, but they go beyond the purposes of the ENP, I believe.
Eléonore, you were
So thank you, Mihai, for your question. Your question made me thought about new values, but actually I don't want to trade the ones that we have, because if we try to think of other, it would mean that those are the wrong ones. But actually, no, I truly believe that those are the right ones, and maybe that's the importance, that democracy is one of our values. Maybe actually we need to improve that, to really develop it. That would be the answer. I think that the problems that we have are linked to not to the essence of our values, but more linked to the populist zeitgeist, another crisis that we have that is related to the new means of communication and the new way that we interact in between each other with the citizens, and what the politics are doing with that and how it instrumentalizes it. So I'm going to stand to those values because I believe that if we really are, if we treasure them, it's a perfect bound for the whole continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question, Carsten. As far as I understood, the essence of your question is about EU considering our countries inferior and trying to impose its norms and values on us, and thus undermining its bargaining power because it entails some kind of reaction, negative reaction in our public. I would say no. There is no such kind of discussions in our public that EU imposes its norms and values. But there is misinterpretation because the regional opponents of the European Union, they misinterpreting the values of the EU and trying to disseminate false information that certain things that are considered to be taboo in our society are imposed by the European Union, but in fact they are not, and increasing some sort of Euroscepticism in our societies and bringing them close to those regional opponents. That's the issue. So it's not about EU actions, but how these EU actions are translated and interpreted by the media of the opponent entities. Thank you. If I managed to answer your question.
Yeah.
Well, I do not think that this interior discussion about the struggles and the interior struggles within the EU would undermine any less the bargaining power of the EU towards the neighboring countries, especially in the south. But the same bargaining power, I would say, is even stronger than before and is probably preventing some countries from the emancipation that they have been waiting for since the Arab Spring. And the bargaining power is still seen throughout several agreements that are concluded with these countries.
Thank you very much. We gradually have to draw this panel debate to a close. We do, however, have another 2 or 3 minutes before I will then try to synthesize in a few words, or in a bit more than just a few words, what has been discussed this evening. And I will exploit my position as moderator of this debate and pick up on, I think, one of the points that you raised, Anna, and I think it also resurfaced in one of the questions that was raised, and that is, can we actually separate values and interests? Or wouldn't it be more justified to argue that interests underpin values and vice versa? You might want to engage with this particular question, in particular, of course, in what regards the alleged transformative power of the European Union in and vis-à-vis its neighborhood. Is there any one of you who would like to come in on this one? Laura.
Yeah, I think I'd just like to make a quick comment. I think the idea that values are exactly the same or very, very similar to interests is a bit of a pessimistic view, to be honest. And I think if you take a longer perspective, a more historical perspective, these EU values emerge from, as Mikkel described, centuries of culture and tradition, and European interests haven't remained the same over the centuries. They're always changing and they're always developing. So although I think there is a link between interests and values, it's not quite right to say that they're always aligned.
Thank you. Anyone else? Mikkel?
I will say that in order to pursue interests, it's sometimes helpful to make sure that there are certain values in those areas where you pursue those interests. Let's say a stable neighborhood, going from a ring of fire to a ring of peace perhaps, then I believe that the EU values of freedom of press, for example, freedom of expression, and generally promoting democracy may be a way to promote political stability in neighboring countries. So in this sense, values can be an instrument to promote security interests.
Thank you. Anna, would you maybe? No? Right, okay. So instead of, I was just thinking, instead of me synthesizing what has been discussed this very evening, I suggest that I, in fact, give each one of you the opportunity, if you wish, of course, to make use of it, to have a very short and sort of synthesizing, concluding statement that you would want to make yourself. Otherwise, of course, I can try to summarize what has been discussed. Anyone who wants to volunteer? No. Albert, maybe you have a... Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Schumacher. I probably would not summarize, but I would do something very important and something very succinct. I would say that the free will of nations shouldn't be suppressed. And the countries with 17 million square kilometers and more area that try to mimic the European Union and creating some alternative institutions, they should remember and one more time learn their own history. That happened in Germany, where they were building walls, in Ukraine, where there is a mishmash, and in other countries, in Moldova and in South Caucasus, that if they try to oppress the free will of nations, it would entail a backfire. And if, just very last sentence, if I were the advisor of that country with 17 million square kilometers area, I would say, instead of oppressing the neighbors, you had better, if you want to become a true empire, transform your economic growth, if there is such, from extensive to intensive, and to cease this pipeline-based economy into the economy of what is in case of in Japan, in Israel, if it is possible in Israel. In very small country, it must be possible in that country also. Always free will of nation wins. And it would be, first of all, in case of Armenia, I really believe in it in 20 years or in less than 20 years. Thank you.
That is a very positive and optimistic ending. So unless there are no more further comments or questions, then I would suggest that we draw eventually this session to a close. Let me first of all thank our 6 panelists for their very thought-provoking and insightful presentations, also with respect to your answers and replies to each and every question. I would like to thank each one of you for having come tonight to this beautiful venue. I would also like to thank our viewers who have been following this debate from all over the world, as this event has been live streamed. And last but not least, Richard, you might also want to say a very last concluding word. Thank you very much.
Well, I'd like to start with a vote of thanks to the person who could hardly thank himself, to Professor Tobias Schumacher for moderating and chairing this event with such skill and sensitivity and flair. So thank you very much, Tobias. I'd also like to add my thanks to everyone who's contributed to this evening tonight. I'd like to congratulate our panelists, to the historians among them for applying their knowledge and understanding of the past to the problems of the present and the future, and to the social scientists, specialists, especially on the European Neighbourhood Policy among them, for informing their analysis with a knowledge and understanding of the past. In that sense, I think this has been truly interdisciplinary. And one reflection, it came out from the argument over empire. Now, if empires are often founded by conquest and force, but if they are to last, they must be founded on consent and the bedding down of an idea of a common culture, common civilization, common values, and in the end, yes, a common identity. One that lasted for 1,000 years was called Romanitas. But if you have something which is founded by consent, founded by a degree of agreement, but which cannot put down those roots to acquire that identity, those values, that sense of being a culture and a civilization, ultimately it will try and maintain itself by force. And I don't think that empires that have only force with which to maintain themselves will last very long. Maybe a rather pessimistic thought on which to end. I do hope that the European Union will avoid falling into that trap, and I do hope that we can indeed look forward to what Eléonore referred to simply as Europe and Europeans for all. Thank you.